How would you describe a task that is very easy to accomplish? We call it a piece of cake. How would you express complete agreement with someone's statement or proposal? You say, absolutely. How would you indicate that someone should go ahead of you or take their turn first? The polite phrase is, after you. How would you express a consistent or constant behavior or occurrence? You would use the word always. How would you describe something that is impressive, extraordinary, or awe-inspiring? The perfect word is amazing. How do you ask someone to continue their story or explanation? You just say, and then. How do you ask for suggestions or creative solutions to a problem? You can ask, any good ideas? How would you respond to someone's request, indicating that you are available and willing to help? You can simply say, anytime. How do you inquire if anyone is present in the house or room? You'd call out, anybody home? How do you ask if there is anything additional needed or required? You ask, anything else? How do you ask someone if they are waiting in a queue? You might ask, are you in line? How do you express disbelief or surprise? Often implying that you find a situation hard to believe or accept. You might exclaim, are you kidding? How do you ask someone if they are telling the truth or if they are earnest about a situation or statement? You might inquire, are you serious? How would you express relief or satisfaction when something anticipated or desired finally happens? You'd say, at last. How would you get people's focus and request their immediate attention? You'd announce, attention, please. How would you express excitement, enthusiasm, or admiration towards something or someone? You'd shout, awesome. How would you ask someone to provide support or assistance in a situation or argument? You'd say, back me up. How would you give someone permission to do something or invite them to do as they please? You'd offer, be my guest. What advice would you give me when I'm anxious for the test results? You'd say, be patient. What would you advise someone constantly late to meetings? You'd tell them, be punctual. What would you say if you need to put a phone call on hold briefly? You'd say, be right back with you. What do you say to people when they enter your office for a meeting? You'd tell them, be seated. What's a less polite way of telling someone to go away? You might say, beat it. What would you say to order a drink at a bar? You'd simply say, beer, please. What do you tell your little brother before you take him to a formal event? You'd say, behave yourself. What do you say when someone arrives late but finally completes a task? You'd say, better late than never. What's your response to receiving a smaller bonus than expected? You'd say, better than nothing. How would you express intense physical pain? You'd exclaim, boy, it hurts. What would you say to stop a fight? You'd shout, break it up. How would you ask someone to use your nickname instead of your full name? You'd say, call me Sam, please. How do you ask someone if they could transport you in their vehicle? The answer is, can I get a ride? How do you ask someone to predict or make an educated guess about something? The answer is, can you guess? How do you check if someone is able to hear you clearly during a conversation? Often over a call or through a microphone. The answer is, can you hear me now? How do you request assistance or support from someone? The answer is, can you help me? What would you say if you completely agree with an undeniable fact? The answer is, can't argue with that. How would you describe an experience that is at its utmost perfection? The answer is, can't be better than this. How do you ask someone to choose their method of payment, either using cash or a credit debit card? The answer is, cash or charge. How would you say goodbye if you plan to see the person soon? The answer is, catch you later. How do you respond when someone asks if they can borrow a book? The answer is, certainly. What would you say when you want to pay for a purchase with your credit card? The answer is, charge it, please.
What would you say to encourage a friend to look at something interesting? You'd say, check it out. How would you request the bill in a restaurant? You'd say, check, please. What would you say to a friend who's feeling down? You'd say, cheer up. What do you say when you raise your glass to make a toast? You'd say, cheers. How do you ask for coffee in a cafe? You'd say, coffee, please. How do you announce that dinner is ready? You'd say, come and get it. What do you say when someone knocks on your door? You'd say, come on in. What do you say when you want someone to hurry up? You'd say, come on. What do you say to someone who just graduated college? You'd say, congratulations. What's your response when your friend shows you their new gadget? You'd say, cool. What do you say when you're not sure about the answer to a question? Could be. How would you describe an ideal situation? Couldn't be better than this. Do you think you'll pass the exam? Definitely. How was the new dessert at the bakery? Delicious. Will you come to the party tonight? Depends. How do you ask if someone received something or understood a concept or information you provided? Did you get it? How do you express frustration or incredulity when someone doesn't seem to have understood or followed your instructions? Didn't I make myself clear? What was your reaction to the spoiled food? Disgusting. How do you ask if you have knowledge of something, or if you are supposed to recognize something? Do I know it? How do you ask for someone's opinion on your appearance? Do I look all right? How do you ask if someone understands what you're saying or explaining? You may say, do you follow me? How do you inquire if someone has brought all the necessary items with them? You may say, do you have everything with you? How do you ask someone if they also do something? Usually used as a follow-up to a statement you've made about yourself. You may say, do you? How do you ask about someone's well-being, or how they're coping with a situation? You may say, doing okay? What advice would you give to someone who is overthinking a situation? You may say, don't get too serious. What would you say to someone who is hesitant about taking a good opportunity? You may say, don't miss the boat. What would you tell someone who is taking too many risks? You may say, don't press your luck. What would you say when you don't want to explain why you're upset? You may say, don't ask. What would you say to encourage a friend who is scared to try something new? You may say, don't be a chicken. What do you tell a child who is scared of the dark? You may say, don't be afraid. What would you tell someone making imprudent decisions? You may say, don't be foolish. What do you say to someone who's understating their achievements? You may say, don't be modest. What advice would you give to a person hesitant to speak at a meeting? You may say, don't be shy. What would you tell someone who is unnecessarily worrying over something? You may say, don't be silly. What would you say when you're busy and someone's disturbing you? You may say, don't bother me. What would you say if you don't need help with something? You may say, don't bother. What would you say when someone tries to divert a discussion? You may say, don't change the subject. What do you say to calm a friend who's getting angry? You may say, don't get upset. What do you say to emphasize the importance of trust in a situation? You may say, don't let me down. What would you say to a ridiculous suggestion? You may say, don't make me laugh. What would you say to warn someone about your patience limits? You may say, don't mess with me. What could you say if you're feeling pressured? You may say, don't push me. What would you tell someone who is taking unnecessary risks? You may say, don't push your luck. What do you say when people are shoving in a crowded place? You may say, don't push. What do you say to someone who is considering stirring up a stable situation? You may say, don't rock the boat. What do you tell a friend who's concerned about a minor mistake they made? You may say, don't worry about it. What do you say when your friend is leaving in their car? You may say, drive safely. How do you advise someone to slow down and be careful? You may say, easy does it. What do you say when serving someone food at a restaurant? You may say, enjoy your meal. What do you say when you want a bad behavior to stop? You may say, enough is enough.
How would you respond if someone perfectly described your thoughts on a topic? You may say, exactly. How do you express approval of a job well done? You may say, excellent. What do you say to get someone's attention politely in public? You may say, excuse me. How would you respond if someone inaccurately described you as an extrovert? You may say, far from it. How would you describe a situation with equal chances of success and failure? You may say, 50-50. What do you say when you want someone to come with you? You may say, follow me. How do you ask if a change or situation is permanent? You may say, for good. How do you ask about the reason or purpose for something? You may say, for what? What do you say when you no longer want to discuss an upsetting topic? You may say, forget it. What do you instruct someone to do when to raise a queue? You may say, get in the line. How might you rudely tell someone you want them to leave? You may say, get lost. What do you say when someone is pressuring or nagging you too much? You may say, get off my back. What would you say to someone who's being unrealistic? You may say, get real. How do you ask someone if they understand a situation, often after a detailed or complicated explanation? You may say, get the picture. How might you ask someone to stop doing something that's irritating you? You may say, give it a rest. What do you say to encourage someone to attempt something new? You may say, give it a try. How do you request someone to contact you later? You may say, give me a call. How would you respond if someone asks you to do a task you enjoy? You may say, gladly. What do you say when giving someone permission to proceed? You may say, go ahead. How do you propose splitting the bill at a restaurant? You may say, go 50-50. How do you encourage someone to pursue an opportunity? You may say, go for it. What might you say to motivate someone to achieve their goals? You may say, go get it. What do you say when you want someone to continue their story? You may say, go on, please. How do you ask if someone is moving to a lower floor, typically in an elevator? You may say, going down. How do you ask if someone is moving to a higher floor, typically in an elevator? You may say, going up. How might you describe a result that isn't perfect but is satisfactory? You may say, good enough. How do you acknowledge someone's accomplishment or good news? You may say, good for you. What do you say to someone about to take on a challenging task? You may say, good luck to you. What do you say to wish someone success? You may say, good luck. How might you end a pleasant conversation? You may say, good talking to you.
What do you tell someone who is being immature? You may say, grow up. How do you introduce surprising, exciting, or unexpected news? You may say, guess what? What would you tell a friend who is going through a difficult time? You may say, hang in there. What might you say to suggest someone relax? You may say, hang loose. What do you say when you want someone to wait or hold on? You may say, hang on. What do you say to someone as they leave for work? You may say, have a nice day. What do you say to your friends as they head out for a night on the town? You may say, have fun. How do you inform someone that a particular person failed to attend an event? You may say, he didn't show up. How do you express that a person is no longer important or relevant in your life? You may say, he is history to me. How do you greet someone in English? You may say, hello.
What do you shout when you need assistance urgently? You may say, help me. What do you say when you're offering someone to take what they want? You may say, help yourself. What might you say when giving a gift to someone? You may say, here is something for you. What do you say when handing something to someone? You may say, here you are. What is a casual way to greet someone in English? You may say, hi. What do you say when you want someone to stop what they're doing immediately? You may say, hold it. What do you say when asking someone to wait for a short period? You may say, hold on. How do you ask for someone's opinion or experience, often after sharing your own? You may say, how about you? How do you ask for the size or magnitude of something? You may say, how big is it? How do you ask for the reason or cause of something, especially if it's surprising or unexpected? You may say, how come? How do you ask someone their opinion or feelings about their current location? You may say, how do you like here? How do you ask about someone's well-being or what they've been doing recently? You may say, how have you been? How do you express frustration when someone does not understand or follow your instructions after multiple repetitions? You may say, how many times do I have to say? How do you ask for the quantity or number of something? You may say, how many? How do you ask for the cost or price of something? You may say, how much? How do you ask someone about their holiday or trip? You may say, how was your vacation? How do you ask about the way or method by which something is done? You may say, how? How do you inquire about someone's general well-being or situation? You may say, how's everything? How do you ask someone about their job or professional situation? You may say, how's work? How do you inquire about someone's family members and their well-being? You may say, how's your family?
How do you inquire about someone's family members and their well-being? You may say, how's your family? How do you express your concurrence with someone's opinion? You may say, I agree. How would you express your mild dissatisfaction about something? You may say, I am a little disappointed. What do you say when you're fully prepared for something? You may say, I am all set. How do you inform someone that you already know the information they're telling you? You may say, I am aware of that. What do you say upon returning from a hiatus? You may say, I am back. How would you inform someone that you currently have no money? You may say, I am broke. What do you say when you're on your way to a location? You may say, I am coming. How do you express deep affection or infatuation for a woman? You may say, I am crazy about her. How would you express being moved emotionally by a gesture or event? You may say, I am deeply touched. How do you express extreme tiredness? You may say, I am exhausted.
How do you express extreme tiredness? You may say, I am exhausted. How do you express your annoyance or irritation with a situation? You may say, I am fed up with this. What do you say when you have no commitments or obligations? You may say, I am free. What do you say after eating enough at a meal? You may say, I am full. How do you express that you're starting to feel the need to eat? You may say, I am getting hungry. What do you say to a friend who is moving away? You may say, I am going to miss you. How do you express your admiration for someone's achievements? You may say, I am impressed. How do you inform others that you need to move quickly due to a tight schedule? You may say, I am in a hurry. How do you express your requirement or need for something? You may say, I am in need. How would you describe a vision condition where distant objects appear blurry? You may say, I am nearsighted.
What do you say when you're currently responsible for a task or job? You may say, I am on duty. How would you express an extreme level of fear? You may say, I am scared to death. How do you emphasize the sincerity of your statement? You may say, I am serious. How would you let someone know that you're not in a relationship? You may say, I am single. How do you express regret or ask for forgiveness in English? You may say, I am sorry. How do you dramatically express extreme hunger? You may say, I am starving to death. What do you say after you've eaten to your maximum capacity? You may say, I am stuffed. How do you express your displeasure or distress? You may say, I am upset. How would you indicate your agreement with a likely outcome? You may say, I bet. How do you assure someone you are capable of managing a task or situation? You may say, I can handle it.
How do you express your understanding or recognition of something? You may say, I can tell. How would you express that something is too expensive for your budget? You may say, I can't afford that. How do you express an inability to control a certain behavior or feeling? You may say, I can't help it. How do you express your exasperation or inability to tolerate a situation any further? You may say, I cannot handle it anymore. How do you indicate uncertainty or lack of confirmation about a matter? You may say, I can't say for sure. How do you express strong dislike or intolerance towards something? You may say, I can't stand it. How do you express deep gratitude that is beyond simple thanks? You may say, I can't thank you enough. How do you express that your action was unintentional? You may say, I didn't mean to. How do you express that your statement or action wasn't intended the way it was interpreted? You may say, I didn't mean it. How do you express disbelief in response to surprising news? You may say, I don't believe it. How would you express indifference towards a situation or outcome? You may say, I don't care. How do you express that you don't understand something? You may say, I don't get it. How would you express your dislike for something? You may say, I don't like it. How do you express skepticism about a statement or likelihood of an event? You may say, I doubt it. How do you express your agreement with someone's sentiments? You may say, I feel the same way. How do you indicate your understanding of something? You may say, I get it. How do you explain you didn't find your way to a location? You may say, I got lost. How do you express that there is still a lot of progress to be made? You may say, I have a long way to go. How do you express your decision to stop doing something due to frustration or dissatisfaction? You may say, I have had enough. I quit. How do you express that you don't feel like eating? You may say, I have no appetite.
How do you apologize for leaving a gathering early? You may say, I hate to eat and run, but... How do you indicate that you don't know or understand something? You may say, I have no clue. How do you express feeling extremely tired or lacking vitality? You may say, I have no energy. How do you admit that you don't know the answer to a question? You may say, I have no idea. How do you express that you are very busy and can't accommodate another task? You may say, I have no time. How do you inform others that you need to leave immediately? You may say, I have to go now. How do you express that you're not familiar with a person? You may say, I hardly know him. What do you say when you're impatient and want someone to hurry up? You may say, I haven't got all day. How do you express your full understanding and acknowledgement of someone's point? You may say, I hear you loud and clear. How do you start a sentence when you've just thought of an idea? You may say, I know what.
How do you express your great liking for something? You may say, I love it. How do you announce your successful arrival or completion of a task? You may say, I made it. How do you stress the sincerity of your words? You may say, I mean it. How do you express the urgency of needing something done as soon as possible? You may say, I need it yesterday. How do you acknowledge that you are indebted to someone for their help? You may say, I owe you one. How do you acknowledge that you understand what someone has said? You may say, I see. How would you express continuing affection towards someone despite circumstances? You may say, I still love you. How do you strongly assert the truthfulness of your statement? You may say, I swear to God. How do you explain acquiring a skill or knowledge without formal instruction? You may say, I taught myself. How do you express that a favorable outcome was due to chance rather than skill? You may say, I was lucky. How do you indicate receiving information from someone else? You may say, I was told that. How do you assure someone you will contact them later? You may say, I will be in touch. How do you express your willingness to perform a task for someone else? You may say, I will do it for you. What do you say when you want to make a toast in agreement with a sentiment? You may say, I will drink to that. How do you assure someone you will obtain a certain item? You may say, I will get it. What do you say to someone you care about when they're about to leave for a long time? You may say, I will miss you. How do you express the impossibility of arriving at a scheduled time? You may say, I will never make it on time. How do you subtly express your acceptance or desire for something offered? You may say, I wouldn't say no. What do you say when you're about to join someone? You may say, I'm coming. How would you convey that a person is merely a representative of an institution and doesn't have personal significance? You may say, in a sense, he is nothing but a suit. How do you express amazement or disbelief at something extraordinary? You may say, incredible. How do you ask if there is anything else, often after someone has given you a list or explained something? You may say, is that all? How do you describe a slightly cold temperature? You may say, it is chilly. How do you describe a condition where the air is moist and warm? You may say, it is humid. How do you describe uncomfortably warm and humid weather? You may say, it is muggy. How do you describe something that is no longer fashionable? You may say, it is out of style. How do you express experiencing physical or emotional distress? You may say, it is painful for me. How do you announce that it's the appropriate time to eat the midday meal? You may say, it is time for lunch. How do you indicate that it's the right moment to leave a place? You may say, it is time to go. How do you describe conditions when there is a strong breeze? You may say, it is windy. When might you say something is logical? You may say, it makes sense. What would you say about a slow process? You may say, it takes time. How do you tell someone you have something for them? You may say, it's for you. How would you express that something is unjust? You may say, it's not fair. What's another way to say something is not fair? You may say, it's unfair. How do you reassure someone? You may say, it's all right. How do you blame someone entirely? You may say, it's all your fault. What do you say when you see something stunning? You may say, it's beautiful. How do you show approval or interest? You may say, it's cool. How do you tell someone they don't have to pay? You may say, it's free.
What do you say when it's very cold? You may say, it's freezing. How do you admit a mistake? You may say, it's my fault. How do you respond to thanks? You may say, it's my pleasure. What do you say when it's your opportunity? You may say, it's my turn. How do you deny responsibility? You may say, it's not my fault. How do you stress urgency? You may say, it's now or never. How do you say you will pay for something? You may say, it's on me. How does a business offer something for free? You may say, it's on the house. How do you emphasize that something is not good? You may say, it's really bad. What do you say about a difficult situation? You may say, it's tough.
How do you tell someone it's their opportunity? You may say, it's your turn. How do you ask for a short wait? You may say, just a moment. How do you say something is almost done? You may say, just about. How do you show you were joking? You may say, just kidding. What do you say when browsing without buying? You may say, just looking. How do you ask someone to watch over something or monitor a situation for you? You may say, keep an eye on this, will you? What do you say to encourage someone? You may say, keep going. How do you say goodbye, but plan to reconnect? You may say, keep in touch. How do you ask for secrecy? You may say, keep it confidential. What do you say when you don't want something shared? You may say, keep it to yourself.
What do you say to continue a search? You may say, keep looking. How do you tell someone to not interfere? You may say, keep out of my way. What do you say when you don't want your change back? You may say, keep the change. How do you uplift someone who's down? You may say, keep your chin up. What do you say to stop annoying behavior? You may say, knock it off. How do you ask about size preference? You may say, large or small. What's a casual way to say, see you later? You may say, later.
What do you say to end work or an activity? You may say, let's call it a day. How do you propose going to a restaurant? You may say, let's eat out. What do you say to focus on the task at hand? You may say, let's get down to business. How do you suggest meeting up in the future? You may say, let's get together sometime. How do you suggest applauding someone? You may say, let's give him a big hand. What do you say to review something again? You may say, let's go over it one more time. What do you say when you're considering options? You may say, let's see. How do you propose sharing payment? You may say, let's split the bill. What do you say when you want to attempt something? You may say, let's try. How do you announce someone's arrival? You may say, look who's here. What do you say to someone who's fortunate? You may say, lucky you. How do you order cooked food thoroughly? You may say, make mine well done. What do you say to double an order? You may say, make that too, please. How do you ask for space to pass through? You may say, make way. How do you make someone feel welcome? You may say, make yourself at home. How do you thank someone for a future favor? You may say, many thanks in advance. What's another way to say thank you? You may say, many thanks. How do you politely ask to break into someone's conversation or activity? You may say, may I interrupt you? What do you say to express doubt? You may say, maybe not. How do you postpone a plan politely? You may say, maybe some other time.